This session is about influencing without authority. How many of you have had a parent who has told you what to do because they said so? Some of you may even be the parent. How many of you have had a boss that have told you what to do because they said so? How many of you are that boss? Or maybe you don't want to admit that you're that boss. Well, it's okay if you are, you're in the right place. So we have an amazing conversation between Eddie Kim and Maria Latushkin. And so I'll be introducing Eddie, who's our moderator, and then he'll be bringing up Maria. So Eddie is the co-founder of Gusto, the former CEO of Picwing, and he has worked as a senior product engineer at the Volkswagen Group of American Electronics and Research Lab. Please welcome to the stage, Eddie Kim.
Hi, everyone. I have the pleasure of sitting here with Maria. Maria is the VP Engineering of Omadahealth. Before that, she's had a number of engineering leadership positions, including leading engineering at One Kings Lane, and as well as Walmart Labs, was that? Or just Walmart? That was, okay, Walmart, even before there was a Walmart Labs. Yeah, so please welcome Maria. All right, so the topic of this chat is influencing without authority. So I guess the natural question comes to mind, what is influence without authority? I've definitely heard this term before. I've also heard of a term that I think it might be the same thing. It's called, sometimes I'll use it, soft power. So yeah, what is influence without authority?
You know, as I was thinking about it, there's always, like when you come to an organization, there's always these go-to people. And whenever you read books on like the first 90 days or ask advice or like what to do, the people always tell you like, make sure you meet this and this person, like some of you, maybe these people. That's a go-to person. They will help you do things. They make things happen. And the key is they somehow get things done and they help you get things done. The most fascinating thing about these people is that sometimes they don't have any direct reports, they're technically not in the positions of influence, but in positions of authority, but they get things done. And so I think that's the part about influencing is being able to not just do the things that you want to do, but being able to get others to help them to get their point across or create something. And so the interesting thing about these people, the ones that like are able is, as I was thinking about like, well, what makes them so special? Like, what is it about them? And I find out that they usually really good communicators. They somehow, and they're really, really good listeners. And we talked about earlier in the general sessions about the importance of like being able to listen actively. And it sounds like a buzzword, but it's really, really true. It's like you already know what you have to say. And so whenever you meet people, whenever you talk to people, I think the more important part is when you try to make your point across is more listening as opposed to actually talking. I think those are like their two main traits.
Got it. So why is it important to be able to influence without authority? I mean, many of us are working in really fast-paced environments. It feels to me that it would be easier and faster and more efficient just to kind of like, tell people what to do. Is this some kind of like millennial thing these days? Why is this important?
Well, you can tell people what to do. The question is, will they? Like earlier we had a comment about parents, and like, I don't know about you, but when my parents told me what to do, I would nod and I would do my own thing. So it's not just because you tell somebody to do something doesn't mean they're going to do it. And especially if you have large organizations, it's so difficult to check, sometimes impossible. It definitely doesn't scale in whether people actually are doing what you told them to do or somebody else told them to do. So the main thing about influencing is actually making people believe that they should be doing that. And that's the one that actually sticks. And if you want to change behavior, if you want to get your ideas to really take root, I think it's really, really important skill, whether you have authority or you don't have authority, even when you have authority, coming from the point of, and kind of the vantage point of not having authority and taking the time to get people to believe in what you're having to say and persuading them, and really spending the time for them to actually like truly embody it as if it's their own idea and if it's their own belief, like that's the one that's going to take root.
So you're saying you would even recommend doing this when you do have an authority? You're leading engineering at Omadahealth. You have engineering reports. So you still practice kind of influencing your team, even though you technically have the right to, tell them what to do.
I have the right, but like the question is whether it's going to be successful. So absolutely, all the time. And the funniest thing is that the higher you go and the more people you manage, the less direct authority, contrary to what you might be thinking, the less direct authority you really have. Like when you get into leadership, when you run large organizations, there's very little control you have, and there's very little amount of things you can actually do by yourself, and everything becomes so interconnected, so intertwined that you really have to make sure that everybody who is going to be working on something like and executing your vision, they actually believe in it, they will do it as if it's you. And that's where influencing becomes more and more and more important. And plus, even within like outside of your team, you have a boss, you have the board, you have your customers. Like no matter what position you have, you will always have to get your point across through influence as opposed to just being able to tell people.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting and almost like counterintuitive, because you'd think that as your organization grows, you get a little bit more formalized with kind of your official reporting lines and org structures and things like that. And so in some ways, it seems intuitive to think that you would rely less on influence and more on authority the bigger that you get, because it's kind of a necessity as you get larger. But what you're saying, which Gusto is a pretty large company now as well, is actually the opposite turns out to be the case, just because you have less direct communication with people. You have more cross-functional stakeholders, and oftentimes projects are not just like really just siloed to one organization.
And it's so true. Like, I don't know about you, I've had cases where I would sit through these like debriefs of like how come things didn't go well in projects, and it seemed like a scene from like a crime novel. It's like this some sort of a like whodunit. And the thing is, like, it's not that a single, like, you can't find this one culprit. You can't find this one person that did something and this is the reason why nothing worked. It's usually a lot of people and nobody did anything specifically atrocious. And it's just like little things that just didn't come together, and some milestones that got missed, and like something that didn't get articulated correctly. And at the end of it, when I look at it, it feels like people were, like everybody really wanted to do a good job, but somehow the thing didn't come together. And when I was trying to compare them to the projects or initiatives or anything, it can be a launch of the product, it can be a go-to-market in a different country, it doesn't matter. Like when something is successful, what I find is that people are really invested and they know what they're doing and they know why they're doing it, and they feel some sort of a personal connection to what they're doing, as like fuzzy as it may sound and even illogical, like that I find is like no amount of logic, no amount of describing exactly and having playbooks what needs to be done is as valuable as people really knowing why they're doing it. And that takes influence, and that takes investing the time, and that takes providing the context for people that are actually going to be executing that vision.
It sounds like you were speaking a little bit from your past experiences of something that went wrong. Can you share some other examples where you had
we'll
to...
We'll be here till tomorrow.
Yeah, I'd love to hear some other examples, concrete examples on when you had to influence without authority.
Yeah, it happens actually all the time. And one of the things I was thinking about is, which probably like in one way or another everybody experienced, is at some point I was working for a public large-ish company, and I was trying to sell a room of executives on accepting and implementing a data strategy. And once we got past questions of like, what's a data strategy, I had this presentation, I thought that I was so logical, and I had like every corner case figured out, and timelines and charts and graphs, and everything was so great. And I'm giving this presentation and I'm thinking like things are going well, And then I get this, like there's a pause when I'm done, right before I'm gonna ask for more resources and like tell them how we're gonna do this. And there's this pause, and then there's a very polite, like, yeah, this is fascinating, but just maybe not now. And I was trying to understand, like, once I licked my wounds and tried to understand, like, why, like, this was so logical. And was like, to me, it was the only really true path for not the company necessarily, but like for what we were trying to do. And I realized that it just didn't land. Like, there was not, I was telling them what to do, what they had to buy into, and I was almost like yanking them to my point of view. And I didn't really spend the time or try to influence their decision-making or get ground support before I came into that meeting. And the whole meeting was this grand reveal. And the biggest lesson that I had was, if you want to get something like this, especially if it's a complex topic, and so many of us are trained and deal with really complex problems, you have to simplify it. You have to break it down. You have to make it almost friendly, and you have to make sure that there is no surprise and no grand reveal. And like whenever you come together for the decision making, it's almost like a stamp of approval, and the real conversation has to happen before that. And you want to make sure that you have people that will be your supporters in that. And that's what didn't happen to me, is that everybody was receiving this information for the first time. And so it sounded, I think, in retrospect, it sounded complex to them. And so anything that's complex is suspect, like it's an invitation to doubt. And nobody wanted to make a decision because everybody was silent and there was no social proof in the room. And so the things I started doing after that was to make the rounds, to explain it, to break it down, just to make it look so friendly, so simple that it's like almost impossible to say no to. And also make sure that I kind of calm down my detractors and am able to get more support. People love social proof. And so when they come in and they have to make a decision and somebody in the room is already agreeing and like nodding and supporting, it's easier to make that decision as opposed to just coming in and having the weight of responsibility, like in front of your peers saying, am I going to give her the money? Are we going to do this? Like, what's my decision? So support and friendliness of what you're trying to propose, and like no surprises. Don't make sure people don't have to think.
Got it. I think I've heard two really, really great insights so far. One is that influencing without authority is important because, yes, you can tell someone to do something, but in order to get them really bought in, like kind of be really passionate about it, it needs to come through influence and not just telling.
They need to believe it.
They need to believe it, and that helps with kind of the work that they actually do. And the second thing that you just said was around just helping to get buy-in for complex decisions with multiple stakeholders.
Yeah.
So it can help. That skill can help with getting a decision pushed through that you want to get pushed through.
The other thing that I find super helpful in this second point is inviting people to create the solution with you. So that's not necessarily about a presentation. If you're presenting, you're presenting. But when you're trying to get a decision made, or when you're trying to come up with a plan, or when somebody's just not aligned with you, instead of just telling them how things are going to be, and then that kind of creates space for them to say no. If you invite them to come up with a solution with you, they're invested. They're now all of a sudden, like almost against their will, they're trying to be part of the solution. And so that always helps at least a little bit. Sometimes you have to, sometimes people are stubborn. You have to do more work, but at least it's like a step in the right direction.
Yeah. I feel like I've definitely been on the other end of that, where I was like very against a proposal, but then the other person told me, let's kind of take a step back. Let's work through another proposal together. And the end result, looking back, was probably very similar to the original proposal, but because I felt like I was part of the process of getting there, I was a lot more bought in. So I can definitely empathize with that coming from the other side.
It also removes the mystery. Like you feel like you now understand. When somebody just gives you a black box and say, please trust it, like it's harder.
Yeah. I like what we were talking about this a little bit earlier in the back room, and one of the things that you said that really resonated with me as well was that by the time you actually make this announcement or presentation or whatever it is to get the final decision, it's almost like you said, I think your word was like, it's almost a ceremonial thing.
Yeah.
It's like a ceremony because everyone's already the work has actually been done before that actual presentation.
And the first time I heard that, I was like, I still remember the moment where my boss told me that, and I was like, what a waste of time. How do you get anything done? Like, we're just going to come in, we're going to present, we're going to do it, we're going to leave. And then in retrospect, I realized like how useful it is and how quicker at the end of it, like in total time spent, you get to the decision.
Totally. And I totally agree with that. At Gusto, we recently had announced a kind of an organizational change, right? And this is within engineering, so we're not even talking about working with PMs or any cross-functional stakeholders. This is within an org that I led myself. But instead of just kind of going up there and announcing, here's a change, everyone, see you tomorrow, there was actually 2 to 3 weeks of talking one-on-one to important stakeholders in that decision, like helping them to understand it in a smaller setting, also negotiating a little bit one-on-one, and then almost like I guess I kind of call it like our worst kept secret, because by the time I actually did have an all hands with the engineering team and announced the change, everyone's like, yeah, I heard this like 10 times already. And it was just almost like a no-op kind of thing.
But then they accept it so much faster and better and like start actually living it.
Right. Cool. Well, wow, time flies. That was 15 minutes already. So we wanted to reserve, 5 minutes for questions? Do we have some time for questions? All right. So the first question is, how do you influence people in a room/role where you are very new and you don't have enough or any support? So you're the newbie, you're the newcomer now.
That's a good one. I think there are different ways, and it really depends on context. So I'm kind of going to take some shots in the dark, and then we'll see if we're getting somewhere. Sometimes if I'm new in a room, I try to anchor it around anything where I have competency. And so part of it is people trust. If they don't trust me yet as a person, they don't know me, but they trust that somehow I'm competent in some like specific area, they're more likely to listen. If I do have time, before I'm in that room with those people, I try to get also support from others. I try to go and I try to listen, see who else would be interested in this, who else would support this point. And if you're able to get somebody who is from within the organization or somebody who is living this situation to actually, the best case scenario, they'll support you. Not the best case, but also helpful one, they will tell you if you're really actively listening, not just for the symptoms they're telling you, but like for the root causes. They will either tell you why people may think your idea won't work, and so that will help you prepare, or they will at least give you context. And so then you can have an intelligent conversation and you can anchor it in something that people in that room care about.
Awesome. Next question is, how do you make engineering reports, especially the ones that have usually strong opinions, how do you get them to practice influence without authority?
I take different methods. With some, I invite them to think about, just intellectually as a puzzle, look at different ways of thinking, and people that are very competent in their craft are usually typically they're interested in a different way, just like if at least to just prove somebody wrong. And so looking at this and being able to examine different points of view is very helpful. I also start talking in hypotheticals, and this is helpful when people feel that somebody is just wrong, like I'm right and you're wrong. And then if I remove like you and me out of this conversation, because like, well, let's imagine for a second, like, okay, I know I'm wrong, but let's imagine for a second that this is the situation, like how would you respond to it, how would you deal with it? And then it becomes, specifically with engineers, it becomes more, when you're talking hypotheticals, when you remove the people out of it, you're able to get to something that's more open to different approaches, and then you can build from that.
Have you ever read the book How to Win Friends and Influence People?
Long time ago.
Yeah. Has anyone out here read that book? Awesome. Yeah, I think it's a really popular book. I read it a long time ago, and I think a lot of what you
reread
said is kind of talked about in that book. And one of the things that I really like there is emphasizing to engineers or anyone else that the difference between effectiveness and correctness, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important distinction. They're
Do
not
you want to be
always the same.
successful or do you want to be right?
Yeah. Next question is, how do you mentor your engineering leaders and managers to practice influence by authority to be successful?
Maybe without authority or by authority?
Influence without authority, to
Yeah.
be successful.
The first thing I try to do is I actually try to influence them to understand that there's not that far, and really understand, like truly understand, that there's really not far they're going to get on authority. It's for all of the reasons that we've talked about, that sometimes it's like more important to be successful than to be right in something, and that the spheres of control nowadays become smaller and smaller and smaller, and the spheres of influence, because everything is so interconnected, become larger and larger and larger. And so when somebody is, especially with new leaders, like everybody wants to have more impact and get something greater and bigger and more meaningful, making them understand that this is a better, faster way to actually get into something that you're trying to achieve than just telling people how to do it, I think is the right to go. I also let them fail a little. I think that we've talked earlier, I heard in the sessions, like if you don't fail, you don't learn. So you pick something that's safe, that's okay to fail, that's not going to be super damaging to their career or the company or anything like that. And then you let them do it, and then they let them see like where and how to recover, and then hopefully you're right there and you're helping them along through that.
Cool. Maybe one more question? Okay, one more, just because I like this question a lot. Is authority sometimes necessary? Like if everyone played the role of influencer, sometimes maybe you can get stuck in a decision. Like does it ever escalate to a point where you just got to make a call?
Yes. And sometimes it's the time sensitivity, like when, I don't know, when we had production systems being down, it was like I wasn't actually asking for everybody's opinion and like looking at, whatever feelings people may have about the situations, like you make a call and you go. There's also sometimes when people are at an impasse and you feel that their ideological warfare or some other reasons where you have to, whenever basically you have to move on, you have to do it. You have to do it, but you should do it sparingly. And it's like this like big weapon that you keep in your pocket, but you try to make sure you don't have to use it. So, and if you have to use it all the time, there's something wrong with the way you manage.
Yeah, 100% agree. All right, thank you, Maria, for your time. It was really insightful.
Thank you.